It looks like we may be finishing up chapter 4 in video number 8, the Manipulated Mind. Okay. As Frank's main interest is in psychotherapy, he is more interested in showing how such tactics can have the same effects that Watson describes, but without either party knowing consciously what is going on. He cites a study by Bandura in 1960 which showed that psychotherapists do have a tendency to register approval or disapproval of the statements their patients make, in accordance with their own personality traits. 12 therapists were tested for their own ability to express hostility directly and for the extent to which they sought approval from other people. Afterwards, their performances in therapy with clients were monitored. It was found that those who could not express hostility themselves tended to react in a discouraging way if their patient expressed hostility. Those who had been rated as having a high need to be approved of by others also reacted against hostility from a patient. Therapists who could show hostility encouraged similar shows from their patients. The patients took their cues from their therapists' responses. Where hostility received disapproval of some kind, the patient used it far less. Where it was approved, it occurred far more. An even more indicative study by Murray concerned therapists who specialized in non-directive therapy as devised by Carl Rogers. The aim here is for the therapist to convey nothing of his own views and reactions to what his client is saying, but to provide simply a supportive audience for what the client wishes to express. Rogers' theory was that too many of our emotional reactions and behavioral traits are the result of conditioning in our childhood, that it is right to express and do only certain things. We adopt those expressions and actions that bring us the reward of love and attention from parents and suppress the rest. The positive regard in which we are held is therefore conditional on our right actions. The non-directive therapist's role was to provide unconditional positive reward, to exclude warmth and caring for the client, whatever he said or did. Murray's experiment showed that it didn't work quite as easily as that. Sessions with patients were recorded, and it was found afterwards that the experimenters could accurately predict exactly what the therapist approved and disapproved of on the basis of the responses he made to information provided or feelings expressed by his client. His own attitudes were coming across loud and clear, despite his own belief that he had suspended all judgment. The clients were also shown to be affected by the shows of approval/disapproval. They learned over their series of sessions with their therapists to offer up less and less disapproved of material. More will be said on this topic in Chapter 9. Frank warns against distorting the import of all these experiments, while suggesting that a technique of influence of which the person is unaware may be especially effective because he has no incentive to mobilize his resistance against it. He also sees a limit on its effectiveness, the fact that the reported findings apply only to what a patient says. The extent to which this corresponds to how he actually feels remains unknown. As with thought reform, it is important to keep in mind the distinctions between compliance and internalization. Operant conditioning clearly produces some degree of compliance, but that is as far as one can safely go at present. It should be added, however, that one's attitudes are probably affected by one's word. Psychological findings described in Chapter 6 will show that indeed they are. Perry London believes that the power of conditioning techniques as a form of control should not be underestimated. Both classical and operant conditioning have distinct parts to play. Classical conditioning can effectively control involuntary behavioral events such as emotions, moods, sensations, and the functioning of muscles, blood vessels, and vital organs. Instrumental or operant conditioning by systematic application can be used to control voluntary behavior. Both methods, he says, can independently influence various aspects of thinking and attitudes. They can also be combined, along with drug, surgery, or electronic machinery, to make it possible to teach almost any attitude, such as authoritarianism, any skill, or any emotional disposition. He believes that while conditioning techniques have not yet achieved such a possibility, the potential for doing so is more evident than are any limitations on it. He gives an impressive list of the achievements to date of experimental conditioning techniques. A large body of scientific literature shows plainly that conditioning methods can be used to control several types of voluntary and involuntary activity affecting thinking, language, imagination, emotion, motivation, habits, and skills. People can be conditioned to blush or otherwise react emotionally to meaningless words or phrases, to respond impassively to outrageous epithets, to hallucinate the signals, to feel fear, revulsion, embarrassment, or arousal upon demand, to feel cold when they are being warmed, or warm when being chilled, to become ill when lights are flashed, to narrow or enlarge their blood vessels or the pupils of their eyes, to feel like urinating with an empty bladder or not feel the need with a full one, to establish habits and mannerisms they had never known before, and to break free forever from lifelong patterns of activity they thought could never be forgotten. He describes some of these experiments and links the effects they produce to some similar effects found in ordinary life without the assistance of laboratory procedures. For instance, involuntary body processes could be successfully conditioned to such a degree that people who were trained to react physiologically in one way to a series of blue lights and in another physiologically to a series of red lights shown in a certain order were actually physically sick and developed severe headaches when shown the lights in a jumbled order, London says. The natural equivalents of these laboratory demonstrations are seen in psychosomatic illness and even in more common changes in bodily functions, ranging from diarrhea to yawning, which are connected with a great variety of verbal and other informational stimulation. There is every reason to think the basic procedures involved are applicable to virtually every organ in the body and any expression of mood and emotion, with all the therapeutic possibilities that implies. But not all the effects of such conditioning may be therapeutic. London goes on. The techniques of breaking down established meanings, whether in propaganda campaigns or in eliciting confessions, are fundamentally the same as those described in the experiment where the subject became ill. The rapid alternation of individually meaningful signals makes it increasingly hard to respond meaningfully. In propaganda, for example, the Nazis argued that the Jews were capitalists, communists, Democrats and tyrants, racist and mongrel all at once, until the confusion of the messages broke down the meanings of all these terms, leaving only one emotion-laden idea: Jews were bad. Where the intent is to break down more profound meanings, as is necessary to get sincere false confessions, rapid meaningless stimulation is supplemented by anxiety and exhaustion until the victim, ready to forego life itself and surcease of fear and for rest or sleep, takes leave of the last semblances of will. If the method works, he has now become highly suggestible and the new ideas can be implanted. That people could be conditioned to hallucinate to a signal emerged from an experiment instigated by Asaki Naruse of the University of Kyoto. It combined classical conditioning with hypnosis to produce a weird and wonderful sensory phenomenon called conditioned hallucination. A hypnotized subject was required to watch a blank screen. At a certain point, the experimenter sounded the bell or flashed a light and then projected at a low illumination an image on the screen. The image remained there only an instant. This was repeated. The subject was then given a sheet of paper and asked to draw several times the image he had seen. The experimenter then told him that he would forget the whole experiment and brought him out of hypnosis. In his normal state, the subject was asked to watch the screen again. When the bell sounded or the light was flashed, nothing was projected on to the screen at this time, but the subject, when asked to draw what he had seen, faithfully reproduced the previous image. London also draws attention to the part that people's active participation can play in their own conditioning. One Russian experimenter, M.I. Lysina, could not get her subjects to constrict and dilate their blood vessels via the conditioning medium of electric shocks until she actually allowed her subjects to see their own vascular responses as they were being recorded. Then, understanding what the experimenter wanted, they were conditioned very quickly. While the scientific debate will no doubt continue as to how far conditioning techniques can effectively and how far and lastingly change behavior, it can be seen that, taken in conjunction with certain elements of personality which can lead people, albeit unwittingly, to aid the conditioning process, conditioning is a formidable force indeed. Whether consciously applied or in the interrogation techniques, or unconsciously fashioned and absorbed from all that impinges daily upon our senses, it has the power to change behavior, frame personalities, and limit expectations. It can more easily be bred than broken. And that is the end of chapter 4, and stick with me for chapter 5. Moving along in The Manipulated Mind by Denise Wynn.